Welcome to the Project Endure podcast, the place where we talk about life, endurance, persistence, perspective, and so much more. I'm Joe Rinaldi, and I'll be your host. Let's jump in. Before we get started, let me just say that we get it. Personal development can be hard, but you don't have to do it alone. Project Endure has been on a mission to create a supportive and inspiring community of people, all striving to be better together. Head down to the link in the show notes and join the Hard Things Club so that we can do hard things together. And if you're already a member, invite a friend and spread the love. Now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Project Endure podcast, episode 87. We have myself, Joe Rinaldi, and we have a very, very, very special guest in Minnesota, David Swedburg. David, how are you?
Dude, I am blessed and I'm doing good. It's awesome to be on here, Joe. So thanks for having me.
Of course, man. This was a no-brainer. I would love to go back and talk about our history because I was trying to think when we first connected, and it's got to be a few years now, right?
Yeah, I think it would have been end of 2020, beginning of 2021.
Yeah.
And it's actually kind of a cool little story, and I think it makes some sense of when I reached out to you. I was kind of ramping up. I wanted to do this big old goal called the sub 5 and 500. So run a sub 5 minute mile and back squat 500 pounds in the same day. And I had just seen your stuff and been following along, and you were doing the Pursuit podcast at that time. And so I was like, hey, I'm gonna do this crazy thing, and would love to come on the podcast and talk with you. So that's how we got introduced. Spoiler alert, I did not accomplish that goal. And it's funny because as I'm looking at my life and like how I got where I am today, I was like, this is actually it's kind of a cool full circle story of me growing as a person. And it's kind of goofy how you're actually super involved in this, from podcast to podcast. In that, like, at that point in my life, I've always been a super goal driven person, right? Like achievement oriented. And even going back, like, if you psychoanalyze it, like it goes back to being the oldest son in my family, and my dad being, like, hey, I can only count on you to help me out with these things, right? Mow the lawn or do this, hard work around the house, and something that he wasn't doing anyway in a bad way, right? But I grew up with this mentality of like my self-worth is in my achievements. And so when we fast forward to that sub 500 goal, everything I've ever done has been super goal oriented. So I set this goal, and going into it, I weighed like 180 pounds. So I wanted to back squat 500 pounds at that body weight. And the heaviest I'd ever done was 365, right? And in my mind, I thought that I could just put in a lot of hard work and achieve the goal. And so I did these 2 strength cycles back to back, and basically ended up injuring myself. Like, ended up having a herniated disc in my low back because I wanted to achieve the goal so badly. But like, it wasn't about the process, and it wasn't, I wasn't saying, okay, well, if I want to get there, what do I need to do? It was just like, I'm going to put in all this hard work and I'm going to accomplish it. And then from that, right, getting an injury, and then kind of having this whole like, hey, I said I'm going to do this big thing. And then the slogan was, we don't quit. And then now it's like, well, really, I'm quitting this, this goal. Like, what does that mean? Am I, how does my self-worth affected by it? And there's all these other things that are going on in life. And it actually was a pretty dark season because I tied my self-worth and kind of like who I am to accomplishing these goals. So it's kind of this interesting foreshadowing to where I am now of trying to fall in love with the process, and trying to just say, it's actually a book that I bought because you talked about it, but chop wood, carry water, right? Like the goal itself is not the end all be all, right? If I'm not enjoying the journey, and if I'm not growing and learning through the process, then like the goal itself is going to be like a moment of excitement, and people are going to say congratulations for a day, but they're going to, they move on with their lives, right? Like it's not actually like the goal itself is in any way like the highest, or the best thing about the process, right?
Yeah, I have not thought about that book in a long time. That's one of the best books I've ever read. Super simple, a lot of stories. If
Yeah.
anybody's looking for a good book, Chop Wood, Carry Water, great book. And yeah, I've been thinking recently about this phrase. It's not about the outcome, it's about who we become. It's
Yeah.
about who we become in the process. And I love to hear you talk about that. And I think for better context for everybody listening, why don't we rewind it all the way back to the beginning of your story, if that's childhood? I just want to know who David Swedburg is, and then we can get back to
Oh
present
man.
day from there. Yeah.
Yeah. Who David Swedburg is. So I'm a pastor's son. So I think that's like just a super important piece of context, because everyone who listens to this, no matter what their perspective is, they're gonna have a picture of what a pastor's kid is, right? It's either like the worst kid that you knew growing up, or like the most sheltered kid that you ever knew growing up, right? Um, but I grew up in, just a super loving, super awesome family, really close. I have a younger brother, two older sisters, and for the most part, like my life was really healthy, right? Um, but we moved to Minnesota when I was 9. So I was born in California, moved to Minnesota. And the interesting thing there, right, is at that stage in your life, a huge transition like that. I mean, it's kind of like a coin toss how any kid's gonna react, right? Some are gonna thrive, and like my little brother and my one of my sisters really did thrive in, hey, new people, new faces, new environment. But I actually, for whatever reason, um, from like day one, I started getting bullied. And bullied isn't just in this context like called me names. Like I got jumped and like beat up, broken ribs, like physically assaulted 9 times by like this group of 3 guys, from fourth to fifth grade. And so like moving from like this happy environment, like tons of friends and community around our family, to this time where then all of a sudden it's like I'm just getting like legitimately just afraid for my life and totally unsure of why this is even happening. And that was my first real experience with adversity of any kind. um and so I think that's where you take that hardship and adversity, you take just what I talked about of like kind of growing up with this, hey, you're the one who I can count on for hard work and all this. And that kind of brings to really the basis of the person that I became, and the person that I really value a lot of that today. Like I'm not a talented person in just about anything, but I am like, I have a lot of confidence in my ability to work hard. Right. So it's like, I am not at all like physically gifted. I am not like a super athlete or musician or any of these things, but I have that like mentality of, okay, well, if I want to do it, I can put in the work, and I can do it well. Um, so that's kind of, the basis of where coming out of that, right? It just turned into more of like, I got to fend for myself, right? I got to protect myself. I got to, kind of put up walls and not let people too close. And really, it all comes down to like, if I can achieve something that people will be proud of me, and that is how I actually have worth and have value.
That's deep stuff. And I'm not surprised coming into this podcast. I knew we were going to have a great conversation. There's something to be said for having that relationship and that background. And I actually was going through your social media, combing through it
Yeah.
before this conversation. And your last post is a screenshot of the words, "Everyone wants to be great until it's time to do what greatness requires." And to me, that's the hard work, that's the extra mile. For people listening to this podcast, you and I are working together toward your ultra marathon distance goal, and I
Mhm.
see the hard work you put in every single week. I know I have no desire to ever experience how cold it gets in Minnesota, but you put in the work, right? You put in the miles, and it honestly is so encouraging to me. It's inspiring, and I would love to hear more about that part of what does it look like to pursue greatness for you, and what does the hard
Yeah.
work actually look like?
Yeah, man. Well, it all kind of ties into your whole purpose of this podcast, right? And like the idea of enduring. And something I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is kind of driving, what I'm doing with you and this training towards 50 miles, is really this idea of legacy, right? Like, what am I going to leave behind, right? And for a lot of years, I think I even talked about it, um, you know, back 2 years ago with you. Like, there was this moment in my life where I was totally a workaholic, right? Like, achievement based, everything. I was burnt out, right? Like, working 100-hour weeks, coaching at the gym, doing this youth ministry thing, like doing all these amazing, great things. But my wife comes to me and she's like, I know everyone thinks you're awesome, but you're a pretty crappy husband and pretty crappy father. Okay. And like that moment, along with some other things, like my sister and I kind of had a falling out of a relationship, and literally I was the darkest that I've been in my entire life. Like, down to those moments of like contemplating suicide, like, is because everything I was doing was like, all these achievements should be giving me worth, and people should be, my wife should be, I'm so proud of you because you're doing so much. And instead it's like, okay, well, everything I'm doing isn't enough. Will it ever be enough, right? And what's the point? What's the point of it all? And so with all that stuff, I'm in a much better place now, but that was kind of the moment of starting to say, like, the most important thing is, you know, what I'm leaving behind for my wife and my kids, right? Like, I don't want at my funeral everyone else to come up and say, "Wow, David was so awesome," right? Like, he invested in my kid's life, and then my kids be like, "Yeah, like, everyone really loved my dad, but I never got to see him." And so that's where kind of this greatness, it's a redefining of what it means, right? Like, my worth, or the accomplishments are not actually what people are going to remember, right? It's the consistency of character and the consistency of hard work. I value it a ton, and part of that legacy is I want my kids to, as they grow up, look and say, like, be able to say, wow, like, my dad did the hard things. He didn't just tell me to do the hard things, right? He didn't sit there on the couch and say, "Hey, go do well at your track meet," right? Like, I want my kids to say, my dad actually can beat your dad," right? That it's not, oh, my dad's the best dad, but it's legitimately like, no, I'm confident you put my dad up against your dad in a foot race or weightlifting or whatever, and he's going to back it up because there's consistent action they've seen with that, right? So, that greatness is just a redefining of, it's not about the accomplishments, but it's about the consistency of character and the consistency of action.
That's really hard to live out in a world that places so much emphasis on the superficial, on the accomplishments, on how much have you done, what's the outcome. How do you reconcile that difference with that internal deep realization of what greatness means to you?
Yeah. Well, I think, at the end of the day, it comes down to realizing, because of my faith, that my identity and my self-worth actually don't come from like anything at all that I do, right? Just believing that because Jesus saw me as valuable, right, and he laid down his life for me, like that is where at the end of the day, like my worth and value. And everybody has the term, intrinsic value. There's value that you can't work, no matter how much you work to gain it, or no matter how much you do to lose it, right? If you're running away from your family and you're doing drugs in some alleyway somewhere, like you still are valuable, right? You have this intrinsic value. Uh, so I think that's the biggest thing. Now, that's also the hardest thing to, like you said, in a culture that values accomplishment, right? That it's all about climbing the corporate ladder. I've made a lot of kind of career changes, and youth ministry was like my dream job. I felt like it was the thing I was called to do with my life. And I ended up having to leave that job, and that was a super hard thing, right? That's part of my identity, and all these students that I've been wrapped up, serving, and just realizing I have to put my family first and I have to prioritize. Um, all of that is super, super hard to do. But that's also just, it's that daily process, right? It's those daily things of, at the end of the day, it comes down to purpose. And if you don't know what your purpose is, then you're going to be trying to fill that bucket through accomplishments and through other people, right? However that looks. But if you know your purpose, and for me, that purpose comes down to um, being a husband who, you know, loves my wife like Christ loves the church, right? Being a father who um, is just the best example of what a father can be, right? Loving selflessly, laying down my own personal agendas and personal desires for my kids. And I do not do that perfectly. But, that's at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. Uh, and all the other things, like what anybody else thinks of me, like I want people to think well of me, but uh, realizing that at the end of the day, that needs to take the second or third, right? Like, how does Jesus see me? And then how does my family see me? And then everybody else, like that's the cherry on top. That's great. But at the end of the day, it doesn't hold any real value, and it shouldn't be the deciding factor in how I do live my life, and how I do define success. So
Yeah, I agree with that. And I've got a question that's going to feel very random. I promise I'm going to bring it back. And as I ask you this question, I hope everybody listening can also take a second to answer it for themselves. But David, do you know the name of your great great grandfathers?
no,
Yeah.
no,
I
I
don't
don't.
I don't either. I would be so impressed if somebody out there does.
Yeah,
But the point is, your great great grandparents were alive at one point, and their problems felt like the biggest problems in the world, and
yeah.
the questions and the challenges they were grappling with felt like they had a really big impact. But the truth is, they're gone, and you don't even know their names. I don't know their names. I'm sure the
Yeah.
people listening probably don't know their names, yet they impacted your great great grandparents, who impacted your grandparents, who impacted your parents, who impacted you, and you will impact your children. They will go on to impact everybody they ever interact with. And so, even though our lives are small in the grand scheme of things, they're not insignificant. And that concept of what am I leaving behind? What is the impact I'm having on other people is so powerful. There's this quote by Konstantin Stanislavski. I believe I pronounced that somewhat right. And he said, there are no small roles, only small actors. And you could be serving coffee at a coffee shop. You could be a youth pastor. You could be at a corporate job. You could be a husband. You could be a father, a son, a brother, whoever. It doesn't matter where you are. You can have such a big impact right where you're standing. And I think people miss that all of the time.
Yes, they do. it's like my marathon that I ran, I think about this of my marathon that I ran, the whole point was the accomplishment. And my wife and my sister who like met me at the finish line, I actually have a video of it of, you know, I come walking up to them, and they're like, yeah, that was so awesome. Like, and I just was like, this was the dumbest thing I've ever done. Like I felt no sense of accomplishment because I didn't enjoy any of the process. The goal was for the goal's sake. And at the end of it, where I thought, wow, I've joined the whatever percent of people run marathons, right? This small percentage. I got done with it and I was like, wow, I wasted a whole lot of time. And okay, I got like this little medal, and that's all that I have to show for all that time that I chose to pour into it, and it was actually like one of those other big moments that's like, why am I chasing, like, why am I defining my life based on goals, right? Why do I go from goal to goal to goal? And, because when I look back, none of those things, nobody else is still talking about that thing that I accomplished 3 months ago or whatever it is. So,
Now, you alluded to something that I think will likely be your answer to this question, but I ask everybody, what's the hardest thing that you've ever had to handle in life? So, a circumstance that you didn't get to choose for yourself, but that you experienced. And I guess just for anybody listening, if we go into detail or if you go into the depths, just be aware that that's where we're headed.
yeah. Yeah. Knowing this question was coming, I've been spending a lot of miles running and trying to kind of weed through it and sort through it. Um, it really comes down to kind of two different times in my life. Uh, when I was 15, my grandpa died, and he had a brain tumor, and he was like my biggest kind of hero inspiration, right? Like he was the person who instilled that mindset of anything you want to do, as long as you put the work in, you can do it. And he was totally like, he backed that up of anything that I was, whether it was drums, like I want to learn how to drum. He's like, I'll buy you a drum set, right? He's like, if you want to, anything you want to do, you can accomplish that. And so at that age in my life, like I sat by his bedside for like 3 days as he was in his last days in a coma, not responsive, just like talking to him. I held his hand as he took his last breath. And like as a 15-year-old, that's a super, super heavy thing. And I don't know that I fully have even been able to grasp like the blessing that was, like to be with him. Most people aren't like holding someone's hand as they take their last breath, but also the weight that is. And with that, it's just that sense of legacy that I'm really grateful for through that hard thing, of losing somebody too soon and missing out on all that, but also wanting to say like he created this legacy and this mindset in me, and I get to, like you said, carry that on and instill that into my kids, who will instill it into their kids, and they won't know, right, Grandpa Bill, but that mindset, my hope is through being a father and a grandfather someday, that I can help carry that on. But the more recent and probably like the most challenging thing that I've ever had to go through, was that my one of my really closest friends, but my best friend's wife, um, took her life to postpartum depression, and this happened just about 6 years ago now. And that was by far the hardest thing that I have had to kind of walk through and go through in my life. And it's a hard subject to talk about, because the thing that made it exponentially worse or exponentially harder is that I just have this feeling that I never loved Maria as well as I could have, right? And that took a lot of years of like weight. I mean, like mental health struggles of feeling like did she really know how much I loved her, right? How much she meant to me. Um, because if she really understood that, would she, would all of this have happened that same way? So that's by far the hardest thing that I've ever had to live through, that I didn't choose myself.
I'm sorry for that loss. I mean, how do you process that, or what did the processing even look like? Even especially if you had no idea, I'd be interested to hear what it looked
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Um, honestly, it's kind of this wild story of, it's almost like Job from the Bible, right? The wild hardships he goes and all his friends are around like curse God and and just die. And he's like, I can't, right? Like all I can do is just endure through this and continue to trust God. And so, I mean, the testimony of this and where this ties back to, I'm not Job in the story. My best friend Adam is, and when I when I got to him, we were actually in New York visiting my sister, my wife and and I got a text message from him saying, "Hey, Maria killed herself today, and I would call you, but I can't keep it together." Right. So then I'm like, we're almost a 20-hour drive from being back in Minnesota, and I'm calling frantically like his family members. And I get his brother on the phone, and his brother, you know, I'm like, "Hey, Adam texted me," and he's like, "Yep." Like, like, did that really happen? And he's like, "Yep." And I'm like, "Okay, we'll be there, right?" Like that was all that we could really say, and we drove through the night, and we got there. And when I was with, like, I walk into the house and see Adam there, and he's like a shell of a man. I mean, his wife took her own life, and like he watched it all happen, but literally the first thing that he said was, "It's hard to love God right now, but I still trust him." And so, like, when I saw him go through that, and it's his wife, the mother of his two kids, and have that perspective, it was also this level set for me of like, okay, well, if Adam can still trust God, like I've got no cards to play. Like I can't be yelling at God and saying like, "How dare you? Like I'm done with you," because if he can trust God, and he set that precedent for everybody through the whole thing, and it was brutal. I mean, it took like basically we took 2 weeks and like all kind of like lived and cried and talked and cried and just like spent 2 weeks together, with his family and my family, and we didn't do a whole lot of anything, and we just like grieved it all together. And the process of unfolding that, throughout it all is really over years having to recognize like I I didn't, and really what it comes down to is like Maria. So Adam was my best friend, or is my best friend, and Maria, right, comes in, and she's now like he's infatuated, and 90% of his attention is towards her, right? And so her and I were kind of like brother sister, right? Like I just picked on her a lot more than I told her how much she meant to me, right? And so it was over time realizing like I can't change that, right? And um, realizing I hope she knew, but I can't fix that. But what I can do is I can make sure that the people in my life today know that I love them, like that I don't make that same mistake again. And it was just 2 years ago now, on the anniversary of her death, that her mother actually, like, I go visit her grave every year and bring the kids. And my daughter's middle name is Maria, and we tell stories. But her mother came up and said, like, Maria loved you, and she did, like, she knew how much you loved her. And that was like kind of the final healing moment of the process of like having her own mom kind of say like she loved you and she knew that you loved her, was like that kind of put it all to rest. Of I still don't want to take for granted and have that question ever with someone of like, okay, well, did they, I want to live every day letting my, I don't want to go to bed without telling my kids that I love them, right? Just because I want that to be something that they remember versus ever having that type of question mark of, like the people close to me, was the last thing I said like a sarcastic joke, right? Or was I picking on my little brother for him being a less driven, totally different person than me, or was I encouraging him because he's one of the most creative, talented people I know, right? And just kind of changing that perspective.
Thank you for sharing all that. I, you know, almost am at a loss for words. I got the chills a few times. And there are so many beautiful things in that very tragic story. I think one practical takeaway for anybody listening is like pause this podcast and go text or call or talk to somebody that you care about and let them know. Um, I think the other thing too is just that contrast between darkness and light and how Adam could be in, I mean, what I imagine to be one of the worst scenarios a human mind can imagine. And he's in that and it's fresh. And he says, it's hard to love God right now, but I trust him still. Is I've never met Adam. This is the first I've heard of that story, and it makes me want to trust God even more. It makes me want to hold my head a little bit higher on the hard days because somebody else could do that. And I
Right.
think it hopefully makes other people listening to this podcast realize that when you go through hardship, when you face adversity, when circumstances are not in your favor, it sets the backdrop and actually gives you even more of a powerful stage to stand on, to hold your head high and to look at the bright side and to stand tall and to encourage other people. Because if you could do it when things are not good, other people are going to notice that. And I think that's a cool takeaway. And then I'll add in on a lighter note. I'll embarrass myself here for a sec. I also don't know what it was growing up, but I grew up in a household where we would always say, I love you and hug. And, my mom and dad would give me a kiss every night before I went to bed. And so now that my wife and I are married and we've been married and living together for the past almost 3 years, every morning, she's still sleeping when I leave for the gym because, of course, nobody else is up at 4 in the morning. But I blow her a kiss in her sleep and she hears the sound of that. And in, probably 10% awake mode, she blows me a kiss goodbye. And that's how we say goodbye in the morning. And I wouldn't want it any other way. And I'm not actually embarrassed now that I said that because it's just how I want to leave the house every day.
And yeah, it's part of that, the consistency of your character, right? And the consistency of your action backing up your words, right? Because if you tell your wife you love her, she knows it, right? But that the intentionality that you have to not go a day, or to do that every time, like that's awesome, and that's exactly it. It's following that up with action of who you are and what's most important.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And, to transition this conversation away from things that you can't control toward the things that you can, you brought up the big pursuit that we had talked about the last time we were on air that didn't end up happening. And now you're pursuing something different. And I would love to hear more about that because obviously we check in once a week and I get to see your numbers, but I would love to hear how the process has been. And then on top of that, I'd love to hear what the hardest thing you've ever done is on purpose.
Yeah, well, it's perfect because the hardest thing I've ever done on purpose physically is without a doubt, like hands down, the last whatever 9 or 10 weeks of training with you, Joe. Like legitimately, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's so I'm working towards, for background, working towards this 50-mile trail run in May. And so I reached out to Joe. Like, I couldn't think of anybody else who would want to help me prepare for this. But I had no idea, like, the mental and physical strain that training for something that's truly, it's just endurance, right? It is just um, the mental ability to continue moving and to have enough perspective on what your purpose is, what your why is, that you don't stop or that you don't sleep in. I've had, I mean, we haven't talked about it so much, right? But it's like I had 2 weeks of blisters upon blisters on my pinky toes. Like my one pinky toe looked like hamburger, uh, and it's just horrible. And instead of being like, all right, Joe, like I can't run next week because this is so uncomfortable. I was like, okay, discomfort, right? What is this doing? This is preparing me for the 50 miles to come, because you can guarantee I'm going to have something, right? Some nagging pain or injury that happens. And that's why, like, I could run on the treadmill. I could run inside in 65-degree climate controlled weather. But the reason that I try to go run outside, at least 2 days out of the week when it's, the coldest was the first 12-mile run that you programmed for me. And I didn't look at the temperature, and I went out and ran that at like 5:30 a.m. And it was actually negative 11 degrees real temperature. So it was like negative 25 with wind chill. And like everything was frozen. But I truly, the whole point of this, and it's the process thing, is like Romans 5. Everyone's heard the verse, verses 3 through 5, like suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And in those things, I'm like, I could pick the easier route, but if I can push myself mentally, right, I can suffer a little bit more in this 12-mile run. I'm building that endurance and that character all the more than if I just did, not that running 18 miles is ever comfortable, right? But if I pick the easiest way to do it, then I'm not building that endurance, and I'm not building that same mental fortitude and that character in the same way as if you choose, like, okay, how can I make this suck a little more so that then at 50 miles I'll be like, hey, it's 60 degrees. Like, I was running when it was negative 12. So I can be thankful, and I can have that of, well, this is easier than some of my training runs were, because I was running 22 miles when it was 18 degrees last Saturday, right? So it is by far, though, the like when I train for my marathon. So the longest run I've ever run is 26.2. But before training with you, the second longest that I had ever run was 15, because I only ran a 15 miler going into my marathon. And we started doing that like week 3 of training. So every weekend I am running more. Every week I'm running more miles than I've ever run in my life in any given week. And every weekend I'm running right now, the second longest distance that I've ever run. And it won't be much longer here before it is every weekend I'm running the longest distance of my life. So it is truly, you know, it's, again, it goes back to the goal. Like the 50 miler it will not be the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It might be the hardest 12 hours, but the work, the months that went into staying consistent and pushing through it, and all these minor injuries and all that, like, if you look at it as a whole, like, that's going to be what I'm going to be proud of, and realizing like no one else can appreciate that piece of it. They're amazed by the goal, but if I could go run 50 probably tomorrow if I had to, right? And people would be impressed with that. But what I'm going to be looking at is all of the work, right? And all of the growth and all of the lessons and all of the things, how I've grown as a person. And I really do take that as more important than the accomplishment of 50 miles or whatever that would be, of really that mental endurance that's built and how that keeps me, keeps my perspective grounded in any other hard thing in life, right? It's like, oh, you know what? Like the perspective of what's challenging compared to waking up at 3:30 and running an 18-mile run on a treadmill before work because I had something that weekend. Like it's like, okay, like most people aren't doing this, right? Most people won't do this in their life. So perspective, right? The perspective gained is probably more valuable than the actual running itself.
I also want to give some context. You came into this with your back not feeling 100%. On top of all this running, you strength train a couple times a week. You have a full-time job. You are a father. You are a husband, and you don't make excuses. And that's one of the things I love about programming is I know even if we got to switch some things around, it's going to get done. And what I'm hearing you say is you enjoy the character building process. And there's one run I want to highlight in particular. I have your program up here. It was a character building run. It was February 11th. It was 20 miles. You wrote under the effort level dead. You wrote under how it felt. You said that was a battle to not quit and keep going. Period. Felt horrible. And then it was 19 degrees outside. And under the notes column, you wrote, made some poor choices on route, ended up having 4-ish miles of the run on an unplowed road with varying levels of snow to run through. At mile 13, wheels started coming off, varied walking and running, sometimes with one shoe. That was a battle. And I got beat up, but still won. And man, it's reading notes like that just put a huge smile on my face. And it's those moments, it's those runs that I'm sure you're going to look back on and just be so glad that you did it. And we can get a good laugh out of it now that it's over.
That was ridiculous, but it's done. And yeah, it's like, well, I just had a 22 last weekend and it was the first, okay, this run actually went well. Like I actually ran the whole time. I didn't have to stop. Like overall, I felt decently as strong as you can, right? And it's if I hadn't gone through that 20, you know, then I would not have gotten there, right? And that's where I think endurance training is wild because most people will run a marathon once, right? Or a 5K or do whatever really challenging thing once. But then once they've felt how painful it was to do that, they're like, been there, got the shirt, never have to do it again. And it's like every single time that it's like, oh, here's another run, or this is a longer run than the one I died on 2 weekends ago. Right. It's like, okay, here we go. And honestly, I think just to speak to the value of having you as a coach and just having somebody as a coach, right? Is I also just have this mentality, stupid as it might be, of all right, if Joe thinks I can do it, then I'm gonna do it. Like no questions asked. He's smarter than I am. He knows. So if he said I'm running 22, I guess I'm gonna do it, And that's just the mentality that I take into it too. Of if I thought about it, right, or analyzed like that stupid progressive run that you programmed, it's like on paper, I'm like, I'm gonna die. But I was like, Joe says I could do it, so I'm gonna do it. And there's that piece of just trusting the process and putting it in someone else's hands of like, all right, like I'm just gonna I'm gonna execute, right? You tell me what I got to do. I'm gonna execute, and it might not be pretty, but I would hate to quit and say, like I did. I guess I did cut one of my long runs short, but I quite literally, I think I was like, I was minutes away from a medical emergency. Um, and I had to go into the gas station. This was like 3 weekends ago because it was like 16 degrees, but it was 20-mile-an-hour headwind. And I ran for 10 miles into, or 8.5 miles into that headwind. And I couldn't feel my face. Like I thought I was a stroke victim. Like half of my face, I couldn't feel it. And I like walked into this gas station and I'm like, hey, can I have a hot chocolate? And like, I'll pay you later. Like, sat there and like drank this hot chocolate. And then I had half a mile to get home. And it was just like, well, I did everything that I possibly could. So it was on that side too of like, I might not actually meet the goal, but did I do everything that I could given the circumstances, right? And I was proud of the effort. It was, it's like, okay, I got what I needed out of it, which was pushing my mental limits until my body was like, you're going to die if you don't get inside, kind of a thing.
I'm pretty sure in your notes you mentioned that your eyeballs were freezing shut every time you blinked.
Yeah. Every time that I blinked, my eyelashes would like stick together. It was brutal, but it
Yeah.
was good.
And I do love the fact that you don't question things and that you give your best effort. I will say though, if you ever see a triple digit run, like a 222-mile run, I have fat thumbs every once in a while. So just, you can question me then.
That's like
No
what
problem.
Nick said on his podcast. I totally,
Yeah.
well, Joe says I'm running 300 miles this weekend. I guess we'll do it.
You can question me if it ever hits triple
Uh,
digits
all right.
on record.
Triple
Uh,
digits question.
So with that being said, you and I have tossed around the concept of endurance here and there, and I want to ask you, when you hear the word endurance, what comes to mind for you sitting here right now in this podcast?
Yeah. So I wrote it down because I knew this question was coming and I've been thinking about it while running hours upon hours for a few weeks since I knew I was coming on a podcast. Um, so the way I chose to define it is choosing to continue in the midst of adversity because your purpose outweighs the discomfort.
Can you
So
can you read that one more time for people listening?
yeah, so choosing to continue in the midst of adversity because your purpose outweighs the discomfort. And I think it applies right to physical as much as within life. And basically I sent you this because I was thinking about this a month back, that endurance without purpose is actually just surviving, right? And realizing that like when I set that goal of running a marathon but I didn't have any purpose to it, like I survived that marathon, and because I just survived it, I got done and I was like, this was pointless. Like, I do not feel accomplished. I'm not proud of it. I wish I had the time back and I hadn't wasted my time. Um, but in life and in, like with this prep, having this concept of legacy where I'm saying, I am showing my kids, I'll be like, hey, I ran to your friend's house and back. And they're like, their minds are blown because their friend's house is 10 miles away and we drive there in the car and it takes forever in their minds to drive there, right? And it's those types of things, right? It's the strength training where they come in and they're with me. That's the purpose that I have. And so that greater purpose means that when I'm out running or when I'm pushing my limits or when I'm going through something hard in life, um, like that purpose outweighs the current discomfort of the situation, right?
Yeah, I love what you said. Endurance without purpose is just survival. It reminds me of this phrase, resilience is endurance with direction. And I think you can probably interchange direction with purpose there. When you have
Yeah.
purpose, when you have direction and you endure and you show up again and again and again, in the same direction. That's resilience. And that's what you're building. And it's so amazing to hear that you have that purpose, but it also sounds like you didn't have that purpose for your whole life.
Right. Well, and it's, quite honestly, one of the biggest reasons why I do, before this, it was CrossFit 6, 7 days a week. It's these physical and mentally testing things is because I've struggled with depression and, suicidal ideation and mental health stuff for my whole life. And um, kind of came to this point in this realization of that building this mental fortitude through like personally just like enduring physically hard things, it creates this ability for me when I am in the midst of something hard, like mentally or emotionally, to say, okay, like I have gone through these hard things, right? I have been in the midst of moments where I thought I could not go any further, and I did. And on the other side of that, I have the perspective to say, okay, I can make it through this hard thing, right? And the only reason that I know that is that concept of suffering produces endurance and endurance character. And so I just look at it from that perspective. And that's one of the, I mean, honestly, it's up there with that other piece of purpose, right? Like, why am I doing this? Because, I don't want to be in the place. I've only been, like lowest of lows one time while having our kids, and after that, and after kind of coming out of that dark patch, it's like I don't ever want to be in that place again, where I'm quite literally questioning if the world would be better if I'm not there. And so part of this is just that consistently pushing my own comfort so that then I can build up that resilience so that then when life gets uncomfortable, I'm able to say, I have a laundry list of uncomfortable things that I have chosen to do. And you know what? Like this is nothing different.
Mm. Yeah, for people listening too who might not be able to relate to the laundry list of uncomfortable things that you've done, I think just the fact that anybody at any age is sitting here listening to this podcast means that they've made it through every single tough day that they've ever experienced. And
Yeah.
that's also not something to take lightly, because, one day at a time, one step at a time, you've made it through hard things before. You can make it through hard things again, and you don't have to do it alone. And I know the CrossFit community is really strong, and it's a great concept that ties fitness to community.
Yeah.
Our coaching experience, you have somebody there who's with you through the process, and it sounds like that's been something that you've had a theme throughout your life. Is the hard things have been individual pursuits, but also pursuits that you've leaned on other people for.
Yeah, for sure. And that's I think that's a great point of it's also important if you're struggling, right, to surround yourself with other people who won't let you be less than your best, right? You know, I have this conviction of I'm not going, Joe's putting in work to program for me. And so for me to not give my best effort, right, is taken for granted and undervaluing what his time and his value, right? And with my own mental health, right, it's like I have a family, right? Like I have kids. There is so much more. And just like that lowest of low, like that night where I was questioning whether I should keep living. Like I ended up going and my daughter was asleep, but I laid in her bed for 2 hours, like just next to her. And it was like this, like, I can't look at you and have these thoughts, right? It was just like, hey, I have to go be by her. But then I think on the other side, and just kind of maybe like my last thought on it, is like faith is so important. And I think the thing that is actually kind of wild, I actually did a message on the idea of endurance for my church about a month ago. And all throughout scripture, this concept of endurance and like steadfastness is this recurring theme. And I think the thing that's amazing and the thing that we sometimes lose sight of is we're like, hey, life is supposed to be good and full of good things, and I'm supposed to, have peace and joy and contentment, especially if you have faith, right? You're like, all right, like I now have Jesus in my life, so things should be better. But the reality is that, like, scripture promises, like, your friends will hate you, your family will hate you, like the world will hate you because they hated me first, Jesus says. Um, but that's the other piece of, like you said, having that person. And so there's a scripture here in Hebrews uh, that the whole idea of endurance, we can endure because Jesus endured. Okay, so I'm just going to read it. It's Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2 says, therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross. And that's like this wild picture of Jesus endured like the most painful, horrific death. And because he did that, we can, right? We can endure whatever hardship and not just survive, but in enduring, we have purpose and we can have joy. Like that idea of I can go through these really hard things, or like Adam's story, right? I can find joy in this enduring because I can look to Jesus as the example, as that accountability partner and say, hey, if he went through this, right? If he laid down his own life for me, well, then I can make it through this hard patch or this hard thing or this hard season. So I think that's at the end of the day, you know, it's amazing how like the Bible has these concepts that everyone is trying to write the next self-help book or the next inspirational quote or the next thing. And it's like, oh, like all those concepts are already in here. And we're just trying to like reinvent the wheel or trying to find it. But if you don't have purpose and that purpose isn't something greater than yourself, at the end of the day, that's where that emptiness or, your purpose, if your purpose is just to get the paycheck or to accomplish the, 50 miler, those accomplishments fade so fast. And, the last podcast that you just released, I forget his name, but he's talking about baseball, right? And that accomplishment of like that identity crisis where if you're wrapped up in that sport, well, then I can't do that anymore, right? So then who am I? And that's just a disconnecting your value from the things that you do, right? And instead realizing that you have intrinsic value. I think at the end of the day, then you're going to accomplish and you're going to be able to do so much more than you ever thought you could, because you're also not weighed down by this, this endless need to try and prove yourself and be validated and affirmed and loved. And so
Yeah, man, it's the ultimate example. And episode 84 with Colin Raddick is what you alluded to. And it's amazing how many times over the course of these past 87 episodes, faith has been brought into the mix. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I think there's a reason. And to what you said, you know, people all over the world in different time periods, different geographical locations, different circumstances, it all looks different on the surface, but deep down inside, we're all human, and we really are all experiencing a very similar set of emotions and struggles, desires. And it's so cool for me to be able to sit here and talk to people like yourself and have these conversations with people who on the surface look and sound and appear very different. And when you get down to it, deep down inside, everybody's going through really similar things. And so with that context, I want to ask you the final question. I almost think you gave a beautiful answer to it right there, but I'll let you kind of put a bow on it. You know, somebody's listening to this and they're in a dark season of life, maybe they're not sure where to go or what to do, and they're just feeling a little bit hopeless, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, man. It's such a hard question because you're like, I got nothing, right? Like I struggle to wake up in the morning and live this out myself, right? But at the end of the day, I mean, the simplest thing is you need to know that you are loved and you have value regardless of any of the accomplishments, right? Or any of the failures. And I mean, if you can recognize that, and I would just encourage you, right? The only way you can truly find that peace is through Jesus. But if you can come to that point where you realize that you are loved and you have value aside from all of those external things and everything the world would say and the culture would say, um, that's where you can actually start to find peace. And that's also where you're going to start to be able to find um, another level of growth and another level of you're going to reach those things that you want to chase after so much easier because you're not getting all wrapped up in self-worth, right? You're not getting all wrapped up in that because, hey, I have value. Like personally, I might not make it to the 50-mile start line. And at the end of the day, all the work that I put in still has value, right? And I've grown as a person because of it. And so whether or not that specific thing happens, like my worth isn't wrapped up in it. And that's an awesome, like it takes a lot of that weight and burden off of me. And instead I can enjoy the process, chop wood, carry water, go through it every day and just keep on working. So
Couldn't say it better than that, David. Before I point people toward where they can find you outside of here, I just feel like it's important for me to say this out loud on air, but I love you, man, and I appreciate you immensely. Um, I love the way that you show up every single day, not just for our work together in pursuit of the 50 miler, but just the way you show up for your family, the way that you continue to pursue your version of greatness, even if that's very different from what the ego wants or what the world says you should be pursuing. And I admire all of that and more. So thank you for being here and for showing up and doing your thing. Where can people find you and connect with you?
yeah, so I'm on Instagram. D Swedburg, I believe, is my handle, and that's pretty much it. I mean, I dabble on Facebook and whatnot. If you're the running type, Strava, would love to connect on there, and it's kind of fun. I'm in the Hard Things group club, right, and that's probably the best place to. I love going on there every week and just kind of seeing some of those faces. And one of these days, I'm gonna be number one for mileage. One of these days. Um, but yeah, and also, just like Joe, I mean, send me a message. I'd love to talk with you if anything here has, put a thought in your mind or you just want to process anything with someone, just know, I mean, talk to Joe, talk to me. But also, Joe, I don't want to skip over that. Like, thank you, man, for what you said. And honestly, I mean, I can't say how much I appreciate what you're doing with the podcast, the encouragement and just the wisdom and the insight that these things and the way that you're asking these questions. I mean, talk about building a legacy. It's going to be awesome when you have kids and they can listen back to all this and the legacy you're building and the encouragement you're bringing to so many people. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, man. That means the world.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Project Indoor podcast, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review on your platform of choice, and share this episode with a friend. It helps us get more conversations like this out to more people like you. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. And one more thing. If you're looking for a community of people all striving to be better together, check out the Project Indoor Hard Things Club. The link is in the description below. We'd love to have you.